Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to LMG Security's Cyber Alert on the new Microsoft Exchange vulnerabilities. My name is Matt Duran. I am the Director of Training and Incident Response for LMG Security. I'm also a Senior Security Consultant with the organization, Black Hat instructor, and coming out at the beginning of next year, if you're interested in what we do, we have a new book being released. It's called Ransomware, Cyber Extortion, Response, and Prevention, and is being written in cooperation with our CEO, Sherry Davidoff, and our COO, Karen Springer. So if you've ever wondered what it's like to be an incident responder and to get involved in some of these high-profile hacking scenarios, to negotiate $1 million ransom, or to just generally have the same kind of fun that we end up having, take a look at it. We've had a lot of fun putting it together, and I think it'll be a valuable resource, not just for the technical geeks out there, but for pretty much anyone who's interested in cybersecurity as a whole. I'm really happy today that I get to include my coworker, Tom Pohl. Tom Pohl is the penetration testing team manager for LMG Security, and also another senior security consultant. Tom is a seasoned hacker and the winner of many hacking competitions, including Wild West Hacking Fest, Circle City Con, ThoughtCon, B-Sides Las Vegas, DEF CON, and many more. Tom leverages his wealth of experience to support LMG Security's customers and the penetration testing team. And prior to working for LMG, Tom was the head of software architecture at Business Solver for nearly 20 years. He's also, as we've shown on the screen, really nobody special. If you know, you know. So the entire point of today's webcast is to alert you to some new developments in the Microsoft Exchange saga. New ransomware attacks are actively going after Microsoft Exchange servers that are vulnerable to either the proxy logon or proxy shell exploits. And we'll go over what those are here in detail in just a moment. Now, when this news hit a couple of months ago, it came as kind of a surprise because a lot of organizations were under the impression that they had already been patched successfully against these vulnerabilities, and as it turns out, they were not, and there's a number of reasons behind that. But there are several large-scale ransomware groups that are now actively going after these vulnerable servers, including Conti, the Lockfile ransomware group, the Babic ransomware group. They have all been observed in the wild exploiting both proxy logon and proxy shell to take over Exchange servers, take over networks, gain a foothold, and then ultimately deploy their ransomware onto the network. We have a couple examples from a previous case we just got done working. This is an Exchange server that was hit by, or a network that was hit by a Conti ransomware attack. And if we look back on the history of the Exchange server, it becomes pretty clear exactly what's going on with the cyber attack as a whole. Looking back, we see a couple of very telltale event IDs pop up in the Windows Defender history. Now, this was a server that had been patched against proxy logon, but not proxy shell. And there were pieces of this exploit that were caught by Windows Defender, or at least identified by it, which we can see here on the screen. First off, we have a detection for the 132 suspicious Exchange session that's popping up as an indicator of one of the multiple CVEs being exploited here. Next up, we have a secondary notification for a backdoor MSIL chopper. This is the web shell that attackers are using to gain access and maintain this persistent access to these Exchange servers, and what they ultimately use to install additional software and then ultimately deploy their final payloads. After the server was taken over by this web shell and after attackers gained access, we can look through the program execution history and see pretty clearly what's going on. And this actually goes right in line with the Conti playbook that was released a few months back, right before Black Hat, that really detailed the tactics, techniques, and procedures that these cybercrime groups really rely on to effectively take down a network. First, we see the use of the AD-Find utility, which is going to map out the domain. It's going to tell the attacker where the high-value systems are, where the domain controller sits, give them name server information, a bunch of other things they can use to kind of get an idea for what kind of environment they're sitting in. We can also see execution of the rclone utility. This is going to be used to exfiltrate files from systems around the network, usually up to somewhere like mega.co. We see 7-zip being downloaded to compress that information so it's easier to download more quickly. We can see the Screen Connect client. We see the Atera desktop agent. We see Splashtop. Multiple other forms of remote access software, and all of this is going to be used to, again, establish that persistence. We see NetScan again being used to really map out what's going on, what kind of ports are open, what kind of vulnerabilities might exist, and then ultimately the fireworks at the end of the show, a ransomware detonation. And this has become an all too familiar scenario for a lot of different organizations. Now, in the beginning, we had the proxy logon vulnerability, and this came out in early March of this year, 2021. Exchange servers around the world were hit in this massive outbreak of exploits and data theft. It really became a large problem for a lot of organizations. Microsoft released several security updates for this. The FBI released a guide for it. CISA released a guide. This was a big deal. And when it was all said and done, we saw upwards of 30,000 individual Exchange servers in the United States affected by this. Their email inboxes were potentially at risk. There were people who had to take their entire mail systems offline. Large-scale organizations were kind of crippled by this. Communication came to a standstill. Realistically, this was a worldwide mega email breach, so not something that we ever want to have to say, but unfortunately it did happen earlier this year. So what could the hackers do when they had access using these kind of vulnerabilities? Well, the answer is pretty much anything they wanted to. They had full administrative control of the Exchange server at that point. They could use this access to export and steal email inboxes, or they could take the entire Exchange database if they wanted to. They could scrape the system and steal credentials. They could install additional malware. And then they could move to other computers on the network and establish that footprint and persistence that really leads to these high-impact kind of cyber incidents. Now, here at LMG, we have a tendency to like to show you and not tell you how these things actually function, which is why I have Tom with me here today. And again, Tom, thank you so much for joining me. What we'd like to do is actually have Tom run you through some Exchange server trickery that he's been engaging in lately, and have him show you exactly what can happen if your server is vulnerable to this kind of exploit. So Tom, I'll let you take it away.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Matt. I pre-recorded this, so I may have to stop or fast forward a little bit through here as we go along. But here at LMG, we actually have a lab environment where we can set up scenarios. Because obviously, I'm not going to show our this from a recent engagement. I actually found a vulnerable Outlook web access server on one of our clients' networks. And so I've kind of relabbed up a similar kind of an environment inside our penetration testing lab to show you how this vulnerability can be exploited, and then how we can actually take this exploitability and then just completely compromise the entire domain from it. In our recent example, our client was actually already moving all of their infrastructure to Office 365, just like probably many of you are already doing today. And so in fact, from my research, they had actually moved all their email, but their Outlook web access server was still left on premise and still running, but it wasn't being used anymore. And more critically, it wasn't being patched anymore. And so what I'm going to show you in the lab is basically how I was able to, in that kind of a scenario, look at see what version was it running, and then what could I do with that level of access once I hit it. So the first thing I did in our lab environment was to download what's called an Nmap scripting engine script. Guzzy the dog actually put out a nice NSE script that lets you look for Exchange vulnerabilities. And in this case, looks at the HTTP Exchange vulnerability of 2021. And I can, using that script, I can go hit our little lab environment Outlook web access server and say, okay, is this vulnerable to attack? And I don't know why this isn't moving forward.
It is.
Oh, okay. I'm just a slow typer. So I pre-recorded this. I apologize. But yeah, so what we're going to do is we're going to use a tool called Nmap to check for this vulnerability against our Marvel Outlook web access server. And it's going to come back and tell us, sure enough, this server is vulnerable to well, actually, it's vulnerable to some of these attacks. And in particular, this server looks like it's got Exchange 2016, and it's running either cumulative update 18 or cumulative update 19. This tool just says, hey, this is running a bad version. It doesn't actually get into the hairy details. And then with that, we know that it's vulnerable. We can pull out some of our tools in the tool bag to say, okay, what can we actually exploit this? And so I know cumulative update 18, I think, came out in September of 2020,
yep.
And 19 came out in about December of 2020. So at this point, we're looking at an Exchange server that was probably last patched over a year ago. And that, in our client's case, that was definitely the case. And we can talk about reasons why that occurs.
Yeah.
Why, even though that you may have a good patching program, often things kind of get glossed over. But at any rate, so from here, I'm going to download a different tool. It's called Proxy Shell, and it's actually on GitHub. I actually pre-audited the code, and I looked through it and made sure, I don't recommend downloading random proofs of concepts off of GitHub and running them against your environment unless you know exactly what the code's doing. But in this case, I did actually audit the code because I was really curious in the different approaches that people have taken to exploit these vulnerabilities.
That is a really good piece of advice, though. Don't just download random scripts and run them on your computer. Otherwise, you have to call me for a different reason.
Right. So I'm cloning the Proxy Shell vulnerability right from GitHub, and then we can go ahead and run this utility against our vulnerable Outlook Web Access server. And so with that, this one in particular is really cool because what it does is it first will tell you the exact Exchange version you're running with the exact patch level, which is really kind of awesome. So in this particular case, I was able to tell the client, this is exactly what you're running. This is the exact set of patches that you need to run in order to get up to date. Because with Exchange, it can be complicated. And then what it does is it actually goes through every mailbox it can find on the local system. And it shows us that we're already running NT Authority system. Like when we're able to run commands, we actually have a pretty high level of access against this Exchange server already. But what it's going to do in this particular case is find a user account that we can basically act as and run PowerShell commands directly against a web exposed PowerShell service that's internal to the Exchange server. So basically, we're going through the front door of Outlook Web Access, and we're hitting kind of an inside door of this PowerShell Exchange PowerShell service that is actually running internally on the Exchange server.
Now, Tom, is this a full version of PowerShell you have access to here?
It is not. This is a really stripped down version of PowerShell, which is really frustrating as an attacker. Because as you can see here, I'm going to run the command get command, and what this is going to do is it's going to show us everything that we can do in PowerShell, right? So these are the commands that are exposed to us. This particular PowerShell set of commands we have here, we don't get everything. We don't get access to get user. We don't have access to create new mailbox. In this particular instance, in our client's instance, I actually had the ability to try to create a new domain account and create a mailbox for them. But since this is limited, one of the things I didn't have access to was creating a secure string. So whereas I could try to create a user account, I actually couldn't create the user account because I couldn't set a password. So we're in luck there. But I could do a lot of other things. I actually modified Active Directory. I gave different users permissions to things that they shouldn't have had permission to. And in this case here, like I can still get mailbox. I can see, oh, yep, Anthony H. Stark's got a mailbox on the system. And then from there, we've proven that, okay, we can manipulate their environment. I haven't entered in any credentials. I haven't done anything out of the ordinary yet. And I'm able to see things on their environment that is pretty scary.
That is.
So that's kind of exciting. So then now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to run a tool called Metasploit. It's a very popular tool. You've probably heard about it. A lot of penetration testers use it. Other people use it against their environment. So basically a collection of a lot of exploits and scanning tools and post-exploitation tools in order to compromise a network. And so Metasploit in this particular instance for Proxy Shell has a pretty reliable exploit that I'm going to show you how we can go from just monkeying around with some PowerShell stuff to actually full compromise in the entire network. And so what I'm doing here is I'm searching in their database for the Proxy Shell exploits, and there's an excellent one that was released in April of this year. And so we'll go ahead and use that exploit to go ahead and compromise this server.
Now, I want to point out that disclosure date of April of 2021 is significant. We'll talk about why here in just a minute, but keep that one in mind.
And so in order to use this exploit, you actually don't need very much information. You need a remote host you want to attack, and then you need a local host that you're going to catch a shell on. And so when I say catch a shell, what I'm talking about is basically I'm going to run some malicious code on the server. And that malicious code is going to basically give me direct access to manipulate that server as if I was sitting at the keyboard, right? As if I'm sitting on the server, I'm authorized as a high level privileged user on that machine. So I'm going to set the host I want to attack. I'm going to set up my local IP on that particular lab network, and then I'm just going to run the exploit. And this exploit is really fun to watch. I actually, in the case of our client, I actually had to modify the Metasploit module because since they were in a hybrid environment, it didn't work.
Oh.
So I actually had to manually modify some of their Active Directory settings, and then I had to rewrite the code to say, no, we can skip this step, because the one particular thing that it does here is it modifies a user mailbox and gives that user mailbox the authority to do an import-export. So Proxy Shell actually has 3 different vulnerabilities that kind of make up that Proxy Shell package. This particular exploit uses 2 of the 3.
Okay.
So it uses the SSR as a server-side request forgery. So basically, I can proxy my request to Outlook Web Access, and it'll send a command to other services as an authenticated user. And then the second vulnerability here is what it does is it actually creates an email message, a draft email in the mailbox with an embedded web shell. And then using that second vulnerability, I'm able to export, using that import-export authority, export that draft message to anywhere I want in the file system, and then trigger it. And so that's what it's doing right here. Is it create a draft message? It's exporting it. It's waiting for that export to complete, and then it's triggering that payload, which that payload then basically says, okay, reach back out to my attacking host and grab the next stage. And that next stage is going to be this interpreter binary that's going to give us remote control, essentially, to this server. And so as we sit here, we can wait, and we can see that our stage is coming. And then here in a few seconds, we will basically have a interpreter shell. So, and this is actually a really nice exploit. We can sit here and wait for it because there's a little bit of delay, but it cleans up after itself. It'll remove the mailbox export, or remove the draft message. So basically, after it's all said and done, there isn't really anything hanging around other than log file entries that shows what happened.
Yeah, that gets tricky for responders because these are indicators of compromise that we look for. I mean, the specific string where the web shell's deployed, those draft messages with that text file attachment that's not actually a text file. If those are out of the way, then it makes it kind of hard to tell if we've been exploited by this.
Right, and so like right here, you can see that we just received our interpreter session, and so that the server is connecting back to us, and now we are sitting here about to have a system level access connection to this Exchange server.
Well, and I mean, we can see the steps that it's doing on the screen here. I mean, it's removing log results that show that export command being run. It's removing that draft email. So again, this is a very well developed kind of exploit, and we really need to be on our toes when we're searching for the signs of it.
So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to open up a shell. So we're going to open up basically command exe, and it drops us as if we're sitting at the server, able to run any commands we want. So I'm going to do an Ifconfig here and show that, like, oh, yep, I'm sitting on the box. I can see the IP address of the server. I can see things like their DNS servers. And then, in this particular case, I know that the domain is marvel.local. So one of the tricks I'll do when I get onto a network is I'll say, and I find their DNS server, I'll say, oh, let's look up that marvel.local domain. and what it'll do, in most people's Active Directory organizations, it'll give you the IP address of every domain controller on the network. So if you got...
That can be handy.
So in this case, it looks like there's a couple domain controllers on the network. One of them is on that 172.16.2 subnet. And so we want to gain access to that because the domain controllers are where all the passwords are kept, right? So if you can control the domain controller, you can control the entire network. So let's go ahead and we're going to go ahead and look at abusing our access on this Exchange server in order to gain access to the entire network. And actually, I had a little flub here. I was going to show, and it'll show us here in a second, but I'll recreate a shell because I know what I want to attack, but like what level of access do I have on this Exchange server? I just wanted to prove that I actually have a very high level of access on this Exchange server. So I'm going to open up a second shell here and show you that who am I, right? So I am NT Authority System. Just like that exploit said that we were, I can prove I actually have a really high level of access to this Exchange server. So one of the first things I like to do when I have an interpreter shell and I've got system authority is I'll dump hashes. And so hashes are basically on the local machine, it'll show us basically a representation of a password, right? So in a hash format. And so this is a local account. This isn't a domain account. So this is just a local machine password that's hashed. So if I threw that hash into a password cracker, I might be able to come up with the actual password for the administrator account. And I could do other neat things. Like if there's other local servers on that network, I could use that hash potentially to do what's called pass the hash and authenticate to another server using that same credential. But most networks you're supposed to have a different local administrator password on every system. Is that true?
That is true. Yeah, there's actually software solutions built specifically for that, like the local administrator password solution from Microsoft, the Lab system. If you're running the same administrator password for all your local systems, you're kind of asking for trouble at that point. So I'm really glad you brought that up.
Yeah. So, but in this case, I actually want more access than just local server access. I actually want access to the entire domain. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to load a module called Kiwi. Or Kiwi Mimikatz, whatever you want to call it. I think they kind of changed the name here recently. But with Kiwi, it's cool because you can actually dump more passwords out of memory. And so that's why I'm going to load Kiwi here, and I'm going to dump all the credentials I can off of this box. And hopefully I'll gain access to something else. And as you can see, there's some Kerberos authentication. There's not a whole lot there, but we go look, MSV has got some great credentials, one of which is a Tony Stark user who is a domain user, and we have his NTLM hash. So I'll stop right here and say, likely, at this point, we don't know what level of access Tony Stark has. Right. But I can tell you if his credentials are cached on an Exchange server, he's probably a pretty high-level user on the network. Because if you've physically logged into an Exchange server, you're probably an enterprise-level admin. So I probably have the NTLM hash of a high-level user on the network. So with that, we're actually going to now attack the rest of the network. And so in order to do that, I'm actually technically on the same subnet as the domain controller. In a lot of situations, you're not. And so I'm going to show you how I would normally route through this interpreter session to get to a server on the other side. So the Exchange server can talk to Active Directory, and me on the outside, I normally can only talk to the Exchange server, like the Outlook Web Access. So I'm actually going to turn on a module called Autoroute, and I'm going to, I already know that there's a 172.16.2 subnet that I can reach from this Exchange server. So I'm going to go ahead and enable Autoroute. I'm going to background this interpreter session, so it's going to run in the background. And he's going to kind of be my router, right? And I'm going to turn on Autoroute, and I'm going to route that subnet directly through this interpreter session. And so you do that using a different Metasploit module called Autoroute, and you say, hey, I want to auto route through the session one, and I'm gonna send and it's kind of cool. If you've ever done routing in Windows or Linux or whatever, you route add and you say, here my interface for routing to that network is an Ethernet interface.
Right.
It's the same kind of a principle in Metasploit, except you do it through, instead of an Ethernet interface, you say my route is actually through this session. So I've got a level of access over here. I'm going to say, if I want to get to 172.16.0 resources, I'm going to go ahead and route it through this interpreter session. So it's kind of fun.
That's great.
Yeah. So we'll go ahead and set that up and run that. I apologize. I talk a little bit faster when I'm watching my own demo. But we'll go ahead and run that. And we can take a look at and make sure that, okay, what do we have access to? So it's basically saying for these two subnets, it's going to go ahead and route through session one to get there. And so then after that, I'm going to set up a SOX proxy. And so there's another module for proxying connections where basically I want to use another tool other than Metasploit to go talk to the domain controller. So I'm going to set up a SOX proxy. SOX proxy is basically, it's like a proxy server on your own network, right? Where you can make a connection, to my local machine that will then get routed through to this other network. And you'll see here, I'm running it on port 1080. So if I connect to my local machine on 1080, then that connection will then get routed through all this, path to get to this inside network. So I can go open up to another shell to the same lab environment, and I'll use a tool called crack map exec. And so that's kind of a really exciting tool with a lot of different functionality. And the function that I thought would be a fun one to show for this, to show that the level of access we have on this network at this point, is to run a proxy chains version of crack map exec. You say that fast real 10 times. And we're going to go talk to the Exchange server, and we're going to dump all the passwords off the domain controller. So the first thing we're going to do is we run our special PCME command. It's our proxy chainsified proxy crack map exec. We're going to use that Tony Stark user in his hash, and we're going to go ahead and dump the NTDS off of the domain controller. So we're going to say NTDS, and we're going to use the DRS UAPI method for doing that because it's pretty quick. And then this is the host that we want to attack. So this is not the host that OWA is on. This is that domain controller, right?
Yeah,
so this is the IP address of that domain controller that we saw earlier. So we're going to go ahead and run this, and we'll see if Tony has access to dump the NTDS, which is all the password hashes. And sure enough, we hit there and it says, "Yep, his account's pwned," and now it's going to go ahead and tell us to get a Red Bull, but it's not actually going to take that long, and we are getting all the passwords from all the users off of the domain controller. So this is basically shows that we've got all the things at this point. I mean, we've got administrative control over the domain controller. We dump the passwords. We can go break all these passwords. We can use these passwords and other pass the hash to get access to other resources on the network. Some of the other cool things that you can do with crack map exec is, and I'll show you here in a second, but you can explore other parts of the network. You can dump the password policy. You can say, "Ooh, what is their password policy? Is it like 27 characters with the blood of your firstborn, or is it pretty easy?" So you can kind of get a feeling for how protected is their network just by saying, "Gosh, how is what is the policy here?" And you can see, their password policy 6. They don't keep any history, and you can in their password account lockout. Should you need that, in the threshold. It's like, so if you lock somebody out, they'll be unlocked in about half an hour. So
man, that was a great demo, Tom. I hear you and the pen testers talk about domain admin before lunch. So I mean, basically, you're telling me if you can hit an Exchange server, I mean, you're done at that point, more or less.
More or less. I simplified this example from a little bit easier than the real world. In the real world, hopefully you're running antivirus in your Exchange server. Hopefully, so you have to do some additional evasion tactics or do some things to hopefully gain access. It's not just as easy as I make it look here in the real world, but it is still pretty darn easy.
Man, that is terrifying. Again, Tom, thank you for that demo. That was amazing. So let's finish up here really quick because I know we're coming right up on the end of our time, and then we'll take a couple of questions. So who is affected by these vulnerabilities, both Proxy Logon and Proxy Shell? Like, who out there is actually going to be affected if one of these is attempted? Well, the answer is pretty much anyone who's running on-premise Exchange. As far as we know, on-premise Exchange. Microsoft has still not given us any indication that the cloud version of Exchange was affected, and hopefully it stays that way. But any public-facing server is vulnerable, and right now, we're seeing some pretty easy-to-track events that show mass scanning and exploitation of these. So if there's a vulnerable server out there, there's a really good chance that it has been at least probed for the presence of this vulnerability. We have a couple of cases that we're working right now where that is the case. Now, going back to March, I mean, this has been exploited wildly in the entire United States. We have about 30,000 U.S. hosts that were in March hacked by this, and that number has continuously gone up. The attack originally was blamed on China and had morphed into kind of a global crisis. This was the Hafnium group that was credited with the original deployment of this exploit. And as we move forward, we're seeing the ramp up in the basically the severity of the scanning and exploitation of this. Again, going back, this attack was the number of hacked servers was doubling about every 2 hours. I mean, this was a critical vulnerability, and a lot of people were falling victim to it, which is never something we want to see. I mean, we'd like to see a vulnerability get released. If God forbid it does get out in the public, we want to see it patched quickly and not explode into the gigantic mess that this turned into. Now, Microsoft was actually warned a few months prior to the release of these exploits that this was going to be a problem. There was a specific cybersecurity research firm that was providing them proof of concept code, and it looks like at some point or another the proof of concept code got leaked out, and that's how the Hafnium group actually got their hands on it and began the attack in the first place. Proxy logon consisted of 4 unique vulnerabilities, or consists of. You can see the ones that are listed here on the screen. These are all covered in the cumulative updates that we'll talk about here in a minute. So if your Exchange server is this far out of date, you're probably in real trouble, but we'll go through how you can fix it. Microsoft, again, knew about this for a while. So the original variations of this exploit were made available to them in January of 2021. We're going back almost a year at this point. As by the time we hit March, Microsoft did release patches for those 4 discovered vulnerabilities. By the day after that patch release, we saw tens of thousands of Exchange servers being compromised. This was, again, a mass scanning and seeding event. We got a report on this on March 5th, and then on March 6th, we saw a CISA advisory. So this is well known that this is a problem. People should be patching their servers, and the people who were vulnerable to this who had patched felt like they were in a pretty good position until we enter Proxy Shell. Now, Proxy Shell is a continuation of the proxy logon exploits. It accomplishes much the same thing, but it utilizes different vulnerabilities in the system to achieve that result. So we saw a patch for CVE 2021-34-473. This came out on April 13th of 2021. We saw a patch for the privilege vulnerability that Tom was talking about. This was also April. We saw a security feature bypass released in May. However, Microsoft inadvertently omitted these from direct publication until July. So there was about a 2-month period where people who thought they were covered by installing cumulative security updates and following the normal patching schedule were actually vulnerable to this, which is one of the reasons why we see such a widespread deployment at this point. Remember, if you were affected by this and these web shells were installed on your system, just patching does not fix that problem. It makes it so it can't happen again, but those web shells are still there and people can still actually access them. The hard truth here is that any public-facing Exchange server is potentially compromised at this point. So we want to influence people to actually take a look at their systems and make sure that they're not suffering from an undisclosed attack at this point. The vulnerable code has been in place for over 10 years in Microsoft systems, so it has been around for a while. If you do find web shells on your network, I would advise you to treat it as a full network compromise. I mean, this is a potentially serious problem. It involves a very high potential for data theft, and you may need to contact an IR or forensics firm for a full investigation, including forensic imaging, activity tracking, and any other kind of risk assessments that you want to perform. So how do you know if this has affected you? Like, how do you actually know if you've been exploited at this point? Well, the very first thing you can do that's a pretty easy win is to check your IIS logs. Take a look for some very specific kind of keywords in the log file, like Python-requests. That's a pretty good indicator that there's been something bad inside your system, and you can kind of track the information from there. Also, look for non-standard user agent strings. If you're seeing things like the older Mozilla Firefox kits being used, or if you're seeing Opera or something that is that's outside the norm from the people that are normally getting into your server, big red flag there. Take a look in your INET pub files, so the www.root ASP.NET_client folder, and see if there are any randomly named or strangely named or newly created files in that folder. Same thing as we saw in Tom's example, that HTTP proxy OWA folder. That is a very common location that we see these web shells being dropped. It's not the only one, but it's commonly where we'll see kind of the more scripted variations of this exploit actually land. And checking the results, this is just an example from one of our lab cases about what those log data pieces actually look like. Really what I want to call your attention to is the return code here. So if you hit a 302 next to that Python requests string inside of your IIS logs, that's confirmation that somebody has successfully probed your server and likely knows that you are now vulnerable to this exploit. Next up, we want to have you hunt for web shells. And these can be in a bunch of different places, but the most common locations that we've observed so far end up in either the program data folder or under the users/all users folder. Normally, they'll show up in a subfolder that's either com1, foo, xyz, something strange looking like that. But it'll be pretty apparent if there's something in there that shouldn't be. Also, take a look in your configuration files and see if there have been any new virtual directories created. This is a pretty sneaky trick that attackers are using to hide the location of those web shells. And essentially what they're doing is setting a virtual path that will be accessible through an intrusive piece of malware or something like that, but it obscures where the actual web shell sits on the local system. So we can see we have a path that's auth EWIFN, which is actually the web shell that's sitting inside of program data. So again, something to kind of keep in mind there. So how do we get around this, and what do we do at this point to make sure that we are not falling victim to any future exploits, or that we have at the very least, this exploit covered? Well, the first thing is to routinely apply security patches. So make sure you plan ahead for the time and manpower. These can be either very easy or very time-consuming, depending on which level you're coming up from and how much or how many servers you have to patch. Make sure you're patching both the operating systems and third-party applications. We don't want to leave any holes open on the network. And then we want to make sure that we track and inventory applications that are included in the system. Patches, we do need patches. This is the only way to save yourself from this one. Again, this is a listing of the security updates that have been released from Microsoft, and this is as of July. We've actually gone up a little bit in level from there, but at the very bare minimum, these are the patch levels that we want to be looking at. So if you're running Exchange 2019, we're looking at cumulative update 9 and 10. If you're running Exchange 2016, we want cumulative update 20 and 21. And if you're still running Exchange 2013, we need to have you up to cumulative update 23. Again, these have been up a little bit from then, but at the very least, this will have you covered for Proxy Shell and Proxy Logon and make it so that you're not directly vulnerable to this kind of an attack. If you have issues with updating, or if there are concerns about how much time it's going to take you or the difficulty in updating your servers, there are some options out there for you. So the very first thing you can do is look at a centralized update server. A WSUS server or a WOOS server, depending on how you pronounce it, is a great option that is fairly low cost, although it does have its downsides. It'll give you central management. It'll give you the ability to update and select individual patches to deploy. You can do control deployment. And again, this is a free application from Microsoft. You do have to have the hardware for it, and it does take time to learn how to use it. But if you're strapped for time and resources, it's a great option to have available. If you don't have that, there are commercial options. So SolarWinds, Ivanti, Atera, Kaseya, ManageEngine, BatchPatch. All of these are programs that are specifically designed to assist in your patch rollouts, make sure that you're up to date on where you need to be, and more importantly, make sure that you can query servers on your network and verify those patches have actually been installed. Tom, we actually just worked with a client that had this exact problem.
That's exactly right. So we have a client. This particular client, I was really surprised because they're very proactive on security, and they're like, no, we force patch windows. They're like, we force updates, and sure enough, when they looked into it, their service thought that they were patching, but it didn't actually apply. And then because the patch management product they were using failed, and they didn't get an alert about it.
Right.
And so and then they actually had some significant difficulties in manually patching. Then after they discovered it wasn't working, and so what did they do? They contacted us and they're like, "Can you guys help?" And this is actually kind of an area that we can help you. That if our team, Matt will be, I'm sure, very nice in saying that, like, we were able to get in there for what they were trying for about 3 days to patch and couldn't get it. And our team jumped in and got them all patched up in what, an hour?
Yeah, about an hour.
About an hour. So that was, a really great thing that, if you're looking at, verification of the patches on your network and you're finding that you can't get it or it's not working the way you expect it to, go ahead and reach out. We want to not just find vulnerabilities on your network and say, sorry about your network, we broke your thing. We want to help you. We want to help you be better and do better every day. And that's what we're all about. So feel free to reach out, and Matt's team would love to help you.
Absolutely. Yeah, we are quick to admit that a lot of the members of our security team are expat system administrators. This is all stuff that we've had a lot of experience with. So again, if you're having trouble or if you're having any problems, feel free to reach out. All right, so we'll wrap up here really quick, and then we'll take a couple questions. So key takeaways from the presentation today and from this entire event, as we've seen it unfold over about the last year, make sure you check your Exchange servers right away. Verify the cumulative update state that you're currently in. Make sure that you apply any patches that you need to. And then check for indicators of compromise. Remember, there are a couple of pretty significant time blocks where patches were either available but not pushed out automatically, or flat not available for these exploits. So if you find those indicators of compromise, take it seriously and call out to a trusted partner if you need assistance. Finding any, dealing with anything you found that's suspicious, getting these patches installed. There are tons of people out there who are ready and willing to help, including LMG. So just let us know what you need, and we'll be happy to assist you. All right, looks like we have a couple of questions that came through, so let's take a quick look there. Thank you, Jeffrey. Jeffrey says, I don't always run random scripts, but when I do, I run them from Git. That is an excellent way to go about it. So a couple of the questions we ended up with are, what can I do what should I do if I find indicators of compromise in my Exchange server? That's a great question, because there's a lot of uncertainty if you do find one of those more high-profile indicators on your system, something that's kind of scary looking that you're not quite sure about. The best thing you can do is reach out to a trusted partner. I mean, there are forensics firms that are happy to help. There are incident response firms that are happy to help. They will be able to pretty quickly tell you if what you're looking at is indeed something that is suspicious and needs to be investigated further, or if it's just kind of a weird entry in the logs, because those do still happen. It's not always you being hacked. It could just be a scanner from Shodan is taking a look at your network or something along those lines. So yeah, reach out if you have any problems and or any questions, and someone will be happy to help you on that one. Okay, well, we went 11 minutes over, so I think we'll cut it off there. But again, thank you everyone so much for joining us. And thank you again, Tom, for being here with that excellent demo. And if you have any questions, please hit us up at info@lngsecurity.com. Find us on LinkedIn, find us on Twitter. And everyone have a great day. Happy patching.
Take care. Have fun.